Billy, are you there? Huh. Ah, there you are. Hi.
How are you?
Okay, I assume you're Billy, right?
I'm Billy. Yeah, it says Madison. Let me change that.
And I'm gonna switch.
Oh, you know, mine doesn't say the right thing either. Mine says administrator. So hang on a minute. Let me just get that right. For some reason, it always does that.
Different audio, click if you want, because it's coming through the computer. We want it to come, no. Yep, that's not. Up, okay. Go back down to the, yeah, do a little arrow. Okay. So have a speaker and pick the display speaker. This one? Yep. Hey, Jenny, can you say something so we can hear you?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yep, perfect. Thank you.
It is like 95 degrees here, which is just, I'm in Maine, so it's not supposed to be 95 degrees. And I can't do this in the study where I normally do it. So I've had to move it downstairs where we actually have air conditioning, so.
Oh,
So tell me where Madison County is. Are you near a city in North Carolina?
yes, we are like 30 minutes from Asheville.
Oh, so it's supposed to be so beautiful, and I have always wanted to go there. Always.
Oh, well, come on.
Yeah, I should. I mean, we live in Nashville during the winter, so it's not that far from Nashville to Asheville. I should definitely do the trip. It's
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, roster.
We are the only library in the state of North Carolina that has ever been awarded the best small library in America.
I saw that on your, your sign off. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
That's impressive, actually.
So we are very proud of that.
You should be. So when they wrote The Bridges of Madison County, was that Madison County, North Carolina?
No, I wish, but no.
What was that?
Oh, Vermont.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah, they did have covered bridges, didn't they?
Yes.
That would make sense.
Wisconsin.
Yeah, Wisconsin's what I thought of first.
There you go.
Obviously, Madison, Wisconsin is the city we know the best, but
Awesome.
okay, so we're good. That's good. When I first came on, it was just me and it said, "You are recording." And there was
Yes.
no one more. It was very weird.
Oh, so yes, we are recording, and we have you on a big smart board in the main part of our library.
Am I
So-
up already?
Yes.
Oh dear.
Yes. Oh, you're perfect. You're perfect. I don't know if I can give you a spin around our library real quick.
Oh, I'd love it.
Maybe. Not sure if it's going to let me, but we will kind of just spin around. Can you see anything?
Yeah, sure. Of course I can.
Oh, over there's Miss Carol. She's waving at you.
Hello, Miss Carol.
Oh. So we had a bear sighting outside.
Bear, really? No kidding.
Yes.
Are you in the hills or mountains or something?
Yeah, we are.
Oh,
We're and let's try to spin you around this way a little bit.
oh, pretty. I see the hills there.
Yes.
You're not going to have people stay away because there's bears around the library, are you?
Oh no.
People are
No.
used.
We just put up a sign that says, there was a bear sighted and use caution.
Wow. I never want to run into a bear, honestly. They scare me.
Oh, me too.
Yeah. Like, I have my old agent lived in Connecticut, and one time she was in the kitchen and she looked out, her kids were at the end of the driveway, and between her and the kids was a big black bear. And she didn't know
Wow.
what to do. I mean, she really didn't know what to do. She started making a lot of noise, and I think it
Oh
ran,
yeah.
but
That's what
scary.
they say. You're supposed to make yourself really look
Big.
big
Yeah.
and loud.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
I
There
hope
you
I never
go.
need to use that information.
Oh.
My cousins live in Canada, and they whenever they go walking, they carry a bear horn with them.
Oh,
And it's
wow.
like an air horn that you use if the bear's nearby to scare it away.
Wow.
Not fun. I don't like that.
Oh, you said that you were writing your next book.
Yeah, I'm working on my next one. Yeah,
Oh.
it's set in Nashville during the civil rights movement.
Oh, wow. Awesome.
Yeah.
Have you come up with a title yet?
No, I haven't. It's funny because Atomic Love came to me like within the first 2 days of working on the project, but this one, I have no idea. And usually your editor changes the name of the book anyway. So Atomic Love was a rare one that kept its own name, but
Oh, wow. That's
Yeah.
great.
yeah, I was happy about that. Although, occasionally I'll get a comment from a reader who's saying, I loved your book, but I hate the title. I was in a doctor's office and I was afraid they thought I was reading pornography or something. I was like, no, that's not what it's supposed to be about.
Hilarious. How long did it take you to write Atomic Love?
It took me 5 years.
Wow.
Yeah, a lot of research. And
Yeah.
I'm doing a lot of research now. I hope this one will take less time. You just never know. I don't write as quickly as I did when I was younger. But when I was younger, I was working full time, and I was a single mom. And so I didn't write as fast as I could have then, because of that. So whatever. I just do the books that I can write. So
There you go.
yeah, as long as I write.
So, how did Atomic Love come to be?
Well, are we going to start or?
We're going to start.
Okay.
Oh, all right. Well, first of all, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay. So I have wanted to be a writer since I was 6 years old. And I read a book and I remember thinking, this book was so transporting to me that maybe I could write a book that was equally transporting. And so I started my first chapter book at the age of 6. I still actually have a few pieces of it left. My dog chewed it, but but I completely imitated the book that inspired me, of course. So I've always wanted to be a writer. I published my first book in 1992, and I've published 5 books. My last 2 have been with Penguin. The one before this was based on the life of Edith Wharton, the novelist, American novelist. It's called The Age of Desire, and because she wrote The Age of Innocence. And then this one, Atomic Love, is about a woman who in 1950, she finds herself as a scientist, as a trained scientist who had worked on the Manhattan Project. She has now lost her job. She's living in Chicago. She is feeling very bereft. And the man who actually betrayed her and made her lose her job on the Manhattan Project, where she was working to create the atomic bomb, approaches her and wants to see her again. At the same time, the FBI approaches her because they think he's selling secrets to the Russians. And so that's the basic idea behind Atomic Love. And I can tell you why I wrote it. Should I just go ahead and start?
Go right ahead.
Okay. So I really started thinking about this book because my mother was a scientist, and she worked in Chicago at the University of Chicago in the late 40s. And like a lot of women of that era, she was, a rare female scientist, but she was expected to give up her job when she got married because men had come back from the war and they were desperate to find jobs. And, here she was. I had no idea. All these years, she was just my mother, but she would say things like, well, I had a very important cancer paper that my name is on. And I would think, oh, sure, Mom. And then right before this book came out, a friend of mine did some research and said, your mother's cancer paper was really important. People were still referring to it 20 years later, and which was just remarkable to me. I had no idea. And she just gave up her job and became a mom and gave dinner parties. And this is what happened. And she regretted it all her life. And she would always say to me, whatever you do, don't give up your career when you get married. Always have something that's your own, because for her, it was a tremendous regret. So I wanted to write about a woman of that era, a scientist of that era. And then another thing came into that. Her best friend was her cousin. And she went to walk to the University of Chicago every day with her cousin. And her cousin went into a place called the Met Lab, but wouldn't tell her what it was. And she had no idea. And it really upset her that her cousin wouldn't tell her what she was working on. And she was working on the Manhattan Project. And I didn't, and I also didn't know this until after the book came out, when her daughter contacted me and told me that, because I said, what was she doing? I thought maybe she was a clerical worker, because there really was only one woman scientist who worked on that portion at the University of Chicago of the Manhattan Project. And it turned out she was developing those badges they still wear to tell you if you've been exposed to too much radiation. They have these badges,
Yeah.
and those still exist. And my mother's cousin helped to create that. So, but she couldn't talk about it. Everything was so hush hush in those days. So that interested me in the Manhattan Project. I looked up the Manhattan Project, found out that there were all these men who worked on that portion, which created the first atomic nuclear reaction. And it turned out there was one woman. She was the youngest member of the project and the only woman. And she was Enrico Fermi, the Nobel Prize winner's mentee. She was his student. And after she graduated, he brought her right into the project. And she was a very important member of the project. And she's written some memoirs. So she interested me, but having just written about Edith Wharton and having to completely go along with her diaries and her letters and tell the life that she really led, because I feel like when you write about a real person, you have a responsibility to stick with the truth. So I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to tell the story of this woman, Leona Woods, whose story was interesting. I mean, she did marry a colleague that she worked with on the Manhattan Project. Then she divorced him and married another colleague and who won a Nobel Prize. I mean, she was right in the swim of things, but I didn't want to tell her story. So I took her place basically as the youngest member of the project, the only woman. What would it have been like in those days to be a woman who worked on the Manhattan Project? So that inspired me. And then another thing that really inspired me was the era. You know, I've read so many books about World War II, and I'm sure that you've got a zillion there at the library, right, Billy?
Yep.
But you know, it's, if you think about it, there are very few books about the Cold War or about anything after World War II. And what interested me about that period was that whenever you see some representation of that era, you imagine, this is what I imagine. I imagine the woman in the shirtwaist dress with the pearls and the high heels welcoming her husband home from the office. He takes off his felt fedora and sets it down. She's got a tray of martinis. And, you know, the kids are playing the 2.5.
Oh.
Should we go on?
Yeah, you're good. You're good. Go ahead.
So the 2.5 0.5 amount of kids are in the background playing happily and everybody's smiling. Everybody's smiling. It's like perfection. This was the happiness after the war. But the truth was much darker than that. The men came back from the war with terrible PTSD and never could speak about it. They weren't allowed to be that weak. And their wives didn't understand why they wouldn't speak about the war. The women, so many of them had been given amazing jobs during the war because they were needed. Suddenly they were let go of their jobs and they were told, go marry. Isn't that what you really want, is to marry and have those 2.5 kids? And so they were resentful. And, you know, underneath all those smiles was a lot of scarring and a lot of pain. And I wanted to capture that, which I tried very hard to capture in Atomic Love. So that was another piece that went into writing it. And the last piece that went into writing it is I really wanted to write about people who were, you know, injured in some way during the war, scarred, like two birds with broken wings. And, you know, I think of Charlie, which is the FBI agent, as who was in a prisoner of war camp in Japan for years. And many of them really were there for years, as being a tremendously wounded person. And Rosalind too, you know, she lost this job which she loved because she was betrayed. She was heartbroken when the bomb dropped, and a lot of people don't realize that so many people who worked on the bomb were deeply upset when it was dropped. You know, when the one thing you've worked on for months or years ends up killing 150,000 to 200,000 people, how do you feel? Even Robert Oppenheimer really never got over his upset over the dropping of the bomb. You know, I wanted these two people to come together and help heal each other, because my feeling about love is that it's not just someone, you don't just find someone who makes you happy, you find someone who helps heal your wounds. And so that's really what I was trying to do. So those things all went into the story and why I wanted to tell this particular story. An interesting aside about people who worked on the project being upset about what happened is that, do you know that I think it was 70 people from the Manhattan Project signed a petition to Harry S. Truman, begging him not to drop the bomb, to use it as a bargaining chip with the Japanese, but not to drop the bomb. Because when the bomb was created, it was because the Germans were also creating a bomb, and America felt they had to create a bomb in order to protect themselves. But when the Germans surrendered, which is around the time that the bomb was finally ready to be used, you know, we had the Japanese left to deal with. And nobody ever thought the bomb would be dropped. They thought it was just going to be something to level the playing field for us and the Germans. So these people all signed this petition to Harry S. Truman, and he never got it because it was sent to his Secretary of State, who didn't believe in the petition and threw it in a wastebasket. So it's called the Szilard petition, if you're ever interested in looking it up. So anyway, that all was really fascinating to me. And I grew up in Chicago. I absolutely loved Chicago. And Chicago in 1950 was the ultimate noir location. You know, it really captured everything about the energy and the vibrancy of 1950, and also kind of a little darkness, a little grittiness, but also the beauty of Chicago. So in a way, I kind of think of this as a love letter to Chicago as well.
Oh, that's awesome. Now, have you ever lived in Chicago?
Yeah, well, I lived in Chicago as a child. I grew up near Chicago, and I lived in Chicago when I was an adult for about 10 to 11 years of my adult life. I lived in Chicago as well. So it was a great way for me to kind of put that down on paper, and all the things I love about Chicago, like the Art Institute. If you've ever been to Chicago, they have these rooms that I write about in the book, the Thorn Rooms. Did you ever go to the Art Institute? Have you ever seen them? So the Thorn Rooms are little tiny rooms. They're like this big. I mean, and they are detail by detail, exactly historically accurate rooms. And they're like 100 something of them, and they're lit perfectly. You can see through the windows, which are really made of glass, and there are trees in the gardens, and it just takes your breath away. And it doesn't matter how old you are. It's a thrilling thing to see these rooms. And in the book, I have her bringing her niece to go see the Thorn Rooms because it was something she had always loved. So that's like, people who live in Chicago, they'll take you there, you know. So
that's awesome.
Do you want to know about the research I did
Yes.
Yeah, so a lot of research went into this book because I wanted it to be accurate, and I wanted to, really capture the truth of that era. And so the first thing I needed to do was read about how the atomic bomb was made. So there's an amazing book called The Making of the Atomic Bomb. I think it won the Pulitzer Prize by Richard Rhodes. And that was interesting and hard to follow to some degree because it is very scientific and accurate, but there are some really dramatic scenes in there. Like the first time they put off the first nuclear reaction, they did not know what was going to happen. They weren't sure they were going to light it. They thought it was possible to light the atmosphere on fire. Wow. That's how little they knew. And they did it right in the middle of Chicago. If you can imagine, they were going to originally bring it out to the woods somewhere, and they just didn't have time because they were under so much pressure to get it done. So, there's a scene where they do the first reaction, which is in my book. And it was like the coldest day of the year. And it was done in a squash court underneath the football field at the University of Chicago, which is just, mind-boggling when we think about it now. And then I read a lot of books about atomic spies. There actually was an atomic spy at the University of Chicago in the 1940s. And interestingly, they knew he was a spy. They had evidence of it because they were able to break the Russian messaging code. But they didn't want the Russians to know they'd broken the code. So they could not arrest this man until they found other evidence that he was a spy. And they didn't do it in time before he was invited to go to Cambridge in the UK and teach at Cambridge. And he left and he was never arrested. And years later I think it was 1992 or 1993, they declassified the information from this code. And he was still alive. He was an old man, but they thought, we're not putting this like 88-year-old man in jail. It's just not worth it. So he never was arrested, which is interesting. But so one of my characters is suspected of being like him, passing secrets to the Russians. And then I read the memoirs of Leona Woods, who was the woman I talked about, who my main character, Rosalind, is somewhat based on. And she wrote some interesting memoirs about how they would go swimming after work in Lake Michigan. She and Enrico Fermi and all her buddies would just, after they worked all day in the lab, would just go splash around in the water, and just things you would never expect unless you read a memoir like that. And one of the most interesting and also upsetting things that I studied, and it really affected me, was the oral histories of the men in the prisoner of war camps in Japan. You know, a lot of people think that the prisoner of war camps in Germany were the worst, but as a matter of fact, that's not true, because they were under the Geneva Convention, which means the men had to have access to Red Cross materials, medical care of any kind. They had to be fed a certain amount, but the Japanese never signed the Geneva Convention.
Oh, wow.
So they could do whatever they wanted, and they were cruel beyond imagination to their prisoners of war. Most of the men died of beriberi, or they died of injuries that there was no medical care whatsoever. They would see Red Cross boxes go into the warehouses and then disappear. And they were just used in Japan, and they were never used for the prisoners of war. They were fed, you know, horrible food that made them sick all the time. It was kind of unbelievable, and they were killed at will. You know, they just had their heads lopped off for any kind of problem that the Japanese saw. And so when I read these stories from these men, it was riveting, because, you know, the thing about oral histories, it's so interesting. It's not just this is what happened and this was what happened. It's what they remembered. And you remember the things that are most indelible, that you just can't stop thinking about, that stuck with you. And so they were the most vivid and horrible and amazing, and also in some ways hopeful stories, because these men had lived when most of their friends had died. So that really went into my telling the story of Charlie, the FBI agent, and made me understand what his life must have been like after the war, when he realized he'd lived. And so many had died, because a lot of these men had tremendous guilt, survivor's guilt, you know, which you hear about, but it's a real thing. So that was just a fascinating read and very emotional for me. And the last thing is something I always do when I'm writing about an era, and it is probably the most helpful thing I do, which is I read magazines and newspapers from that era, because it's amazing what you can discover. You can see what the price of food was when you look at the A&P ad. You know, you can see what the clothes were and what they really cost, not what was in Vogue magazine, but what, you know, the shirtwaist dress you could get for $2.95, you know, at Weebolt's department store. And you can see what the attitudes were. For instance, a lot of them had women's pages, you know, and those women's pages, it would be like, make your husband happy, you know, make him, you know, Jello with carrots and celery in it. And it's like, oh dear. You know, a lot of the women's magazines were really, the recipes were shocking. They almost all had like bologna and cheese in it. most of it American cheese or Velveeta. And, one of my favorites was bologna rarebit. I thought, oh God, what horrifying food, And that was the era that, I was born into. I mean, I came a little bit later, but still, that still was happening all through the 50s and probably into the early 60s as well. Anyway, newspapers and magazines also told me about how the stories of the war and post-war were being reported to the public, including the bomb drop and how people responded to that, and how, just think about the power of an attitude in a newspaper to shift a populace's opinion. And in those days, we didn't have, different channels for different political interests. And this was it. The newspaper pretty much had to tell you the story. And there were op-eds, but not that many. So it's really fascinating to read those. And that was one of the most interesting things I did.
And with newspapers and magazines, it wasn't like they came out daily. It may have happened 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, and they were just now getting the news of what was happening.
Particularly for magazines, were way behind anything that was newsworthy. They thought it was fine to wait until Time magazine or Look magazine or Life magazine would show the pictures of something. There weren't that many photos even in newspapers in that era. It was pretty rare to see photos. And of course, they were black and white. And in the newspaper, you would find out what was going on. Like the Korean War was just, stirring in 1950. And there was a lot of, in my book, they're fearful the war is going to begin. And they're so tired of war, all the years of war that affected everybody. Not just the soldiers, but the people at home. There wasn't food available. Like I said, the women got to work at jobs that they thought were interesting. And so that was a positive, but then it all ended. So, it just, it was a terrifying thing to think another war was coming along so soon. And it did, the Korean War. So, yeah, those were the things that I had to research in order to get it right. And I took just tons of notes, and it was a little scary because you don't want to change history because you forgot something,
Right.
So I can talk about what it was like to launch during a pandemic.
Yes, that would be great.
Yeah.
That would be
So, this book was going to come out, and I was prepared for it to be, things had been going really well with it, and they were going to have a big book tour planned, and they had all sorts of things planned. And of course, it all ended up being online, but amazingly, it did quite well. And I think the wonderful thing is that the Zoom, interviews and things like that kind of last forever. And so there were some, like for instance, bookstore Zoom events that have been seen like 1,600 times, which is just amazing.
Wow.
So that would never happen if you went to a bookstore. The bad part is it really is wonderful to go to libraries and bookstores because you get to see the people who are going to help you hand sell your book and are excited about the book. And, I really miss that. I miss that. Even though I get to meet you this way, it's not the same as if I came to your library.
No,
I'd
the
love
interaction.
Yeah, and I'd love to come to your library and see it and look into people's eyes when I'm talking about it. And it's very hard if you can't do that. So that really was a negative for me, to not be able to do that. But I don't know if I'm going to go on a real tour for the paperback or not. We're going to find out. Well, I guess we'll see how the world is at that point. But the book is being translated into 10 different languages.
Yay!
And in fact, one of the most amazing things that happened is recently a publisher from Iran told me they would like to translate it into Farsi, and so it's just to think of women in, hijabs and burqas or whatever, reading my book just astonishes me that that is something that they're able to do now. And I just thought that was thrilling, and very unusual countries. I mean, in some cases like Lithuania,
Yeah.
it's coming out soon in Lithuanian, but also in the big major countries like, Italy and Germany and England. Of course, it came out at the same time. But it's been really fascinating and a fun journey for me.
That's awesome. Well, I love it.
Uh,
What was a yes moment for you while you were writing it, that it was just like, oh my gosh, this is what I've been waiting for it to come to me?
Well,
It is.
people have asked, what's your favorite scene in the
Yeah.
book? And my favorite scene in the book is when Charlie, the FBI agent, he has horrible PTSD. He wakes up in the night. He has terrible nightmares. He has a horrible nightmare, wakes up in the night, doesn't know what to do with himself, and takes himself. He's Polish, and he lives in a Polish neighborhood in Chicago, which there are more Poles in Chicago, they say, than anywhere outside of Warsaw, including other Polish cities. So he goes to a bar, a neighborhood bar, just because he just doesn't want to be alone. And he runs into a man who's married to his sweetheart that he left during the war. And when he came back from the war with this terrible, horrific injury, she turned away from him. So he's always been heartbroken about this woman. And so there's her husband, who's just incredibly drunk, and he knows he can't leave him there, and he walks him home. And he walks him home to her house, obviously to their house. And she shows up at the door. She's pregnant with the third child, and she's in her nightgown, and she wants him to come in and talk to her. And he's just been so heartbroken about her. He's never really gotten over it. And she invites him in, and that scene between them, I really love that scene, because I guess I felt like Charlie, who's a very sensitive, heartbroken guy, can't go forward with his life until he resolves this relationship. And they have a talk about why she turned away from him and what happened and her apology. And I love that scene. I loved writing it. I still love reading it. It touched me. Sometimes things kind of come to you and you don't even know why, but that scene seemed really pivotal to me.
That's great. That's great. What does your family think about Atomic Love? Are they?
My family is very supportive. My husband is my second husband. We've been together for 22 years now. And, he watched me write every bit of it, and he's always been tremendously supportive of it. And my daughter lives in England. She's been very supportive. Yeah, no, it's been fun sharing it with everybody. You work in a little dark cave kind of when you're a writer. You don't share with anybody when you're working. And so it's really wonderful when you can share it with people, and I have certain people who are sort of my beta readers who tell me if I'm on track or not. But I'm one of those people who really doesn't share with anybody till I've gone through many, many drafts. And believe it or not, I literally, and this is such a round number, you think I made it up, but I literally wrote 10 drafts of this book. And because I just wanted it to be right, it mattered to me that I got it just right. So.
You got it just right.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate
I like it.
Thank you.
Is there anything else that you would like to share?
Well, let's see. One thing is, people have asked me, is it easier or more fun to write about real people or about characters? Like when I wrote about Edith Wharton, like I said, I had to go along with what happened in her life. And I have to say, it's a lot easier and more fun for me to write about characters, because with real people, sometimes you're stuck with the bad decisions they made. And sometimes you're thinking, don't do it, Edith. This is ridiculous. So Edith Wharton had an affair when she was 45 years old with a much younger man who was a journalist. And she is my favorite writer in the world. I just think the world of her writing. I think she's so intuitive and she writes such beautiful things. And she would write these letters to him. I know I'm not good enough for you. And I wanted to kick her. She was like she became like a lovesick 16-year-old. She had never been in love before. And here she was 45. She had had this very unsatisfactory marriage. And the things she did, it was embarrassing to write this lovesick person at the age of 45, but I had to write it because that was the truth. So it's a lot more fun to let your characters do what you want them to do. To go with people. I suppose it's possible I may write another biographical novel, but I don't have it in the works. Not at the moment anyway.
That's awesome. Now, while you're writing, do you write multiple books at one time? I know some people think, oh, I'll work on this one and I'll work on that book. Or do you just focus on one book at a time?
I pretty much focus on one book at a time. I mean, what happens sometimes is you've begun another book and you've sent a book out to an editor, then they come back with changes and you have to drop the book you're working on to go work on that. But I can't do it at the same time. I definitely am one of those people who does multiple things at a time. Like I can't possibly watch TV without knitting or talk on the phone without doing something. I was always the kid who doodled during class in order to be able to listen. But when it comes to writing, I can only focus really on one book at a time. There's so many things to juggle when you're writing a book. If you said something on page 22, you better remember it when you get to page 122, or it's going to be a problem. So, in my aging brain, I'm definitely better off to be sticking with one thought, one story at a time.
Oh, well, it has been such a pleasure talking with you today. And our book is Atomic Love.
Thank you, Billy. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. And we appreciate it so much. And we hope that you can stop by the library one day. You're always welcome.
Okay, maybe on my new book that I'm working on.
Awesome.
Okay.
Great.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.